This courtroom is not a place for janitor boys to play lawyer. Judge Harold Whitaker's voice dropped from the bench like a polished stone, cold, heavy, and meant to bruise without ever touching skin. For 1 second, nobody moved. The ceiling fans turned slowly above the old county courtroom, pushing warm Georgia air over rows of wooden benches packed with reporters, clerks, deputies, and people who had come expecting a routine hearing, not a young black man standing alone in the center aisle with a folder pressed against his chest. Caleb Freeman did not sit down. He stood there in a borrowed Navy suit that hung a little wide at the shoulders, the cuffs stopping just short of his wrists, his shoes clean but worn at the edges from too many miles on city sidewalks. In his right hand was a stack of photocopied records, corners softened from years of being unfolded, studied, folded again, and carried like scripture. Behind him, in the defendant's row, Isaiah Freeman lifted his tired eyes. 15 years in state prison had thinned his face and silvered his beard, but it had not taken the gentleness from him. Even in an orange jumpsuit, with his hands resting quietly in front of him, he still looked like the man who once buffed these same courthouse floors until they shone like black glass under fluorescent lights. Caleb could remember that shine. He could remember being 8 years old, sitting outside courtroom 3 with a chocolate milk from the vending machine, watching his father push a mop bucket down the hallway after midnight, while lawyers stepped around him without saying thank you. Back then, Judge Whitaker had worn the same black robe, used the same wooden gavel, and looked down at Isaiah Freeman as if a janitor's uniform were proof of guilt. Now, 15 years later, the judge leaned back in his chair, his silver hair perfectly combed, his pale fingers resting beside the case file, as though the truth inside it had already been buried deep enough. A faint laugh slipped from somewhere near the prosecutor's table. Someone whispered, "Unbelievable." A deputy shifted closer to Caleb, waiting for the order to escort him out. Attorney Grace Miller, the public defender assigned to the appeal, looked exhausted, one hand still resting on a motion she knew was losing ground. The state had called this hearing a formality. The judge had called the new petition emotion dressed as evidence. But Caleb had spent 15 years learning the language of the place that took his father away. He had read discarded transcripts in the public library until the lights shut off. He had memorized evidence tags, chain of custody forms, booking times, patrol logs, and the tiny mistakes powerful men made when they assumed no one poor would ever read the fine print. The courtroom smelled of old paper, floor wax, and summer heat trapped behind sealed windows. Caleb felt every stare pressing into his back, every quiet judgment measuring his skin, his age, his father's job, his lack of a law degree. Judge Whitaker tapped one finger against the bench. "Mr. Freeman, your father was convicted by a jury. This court will not entertain street corner theories because you found a few documents online." Caleb's throat tightened, but his voice, when it came, stayed low and steady. "Your Honor, I'm not asking the court to entertain a theory." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Then what exactly are you asking?" Caleb opened the folder. A single page trembled slightly in his hand, not from fear, but from the weight of 15 years balanced on one question. Isaiah leaned forward, barely breathing. Grace Miller turned toward Caleb for the first time, as if she were seeing not a desperate son, but a witness the world had ignored. Caleb looked up at the bench, past the robe, past the gavel, past the man who had once mistaken silence for weakness. "I'm asking why the evidence says my father's mop bucket was photographed at the crime scene 25 minutes after he was already in police custody." The room went still. The small laugh at the prosecutor's table died before it became sound. Judge Whitaker's finger stopped tapping. Even the ceiling fans seemed to slow, their soft clicking suddenly loud above the rows of frozen faces. Caleb did not smile. He did not raise his voice. He simply held the page higher, the old courthouse light catching the black timestamp at the bottom like a match struck in a dark room. Caleb had not become the kind of young man who stood in courtrooms by accident. He had been raised in the shadow of that courthouse, in the narrow hours after sunset when the building emptied of attorneys and filled with the softer sounds nobody paid for by the hour. The rolling wheels of trash bins, the squeak of wet rubber saws, the low hum of floor polishers moving across marble like tired bees. Isaiah Freeman worked the night shift there for almost 22 years, and when childcare fell through, he brought Caleb with him. The boy learned early not to touch the flags, not to speak when court was in session, not to sit in the leather chairs reserved for people with titles. He learned which vending machine stole quarters and which clerk kept peppermints in her drawer. He learned that important men could walk past a black janitor every night and never once know his name, even while trusting him with the keys to rooms where their secrets slept in file boxes. Isaiah never complained. He moved through the building with a quiet dignity, pressing his mop into corners, wiping fingerprints from brass door handles, leaving every room better than he found it. To Caleb, his father was not invisible. He was the first man who taught him that work done in silence could still carry honor. On Friday nights, after the last hearing ended and the deputies locked the side entrance, Isaiah would let Caleb sit at the defense table while he cleaned. Caleb would pretend to read from blank legal pads, lowering his voice the way lawyers did, making arguments to empty benches while his father smiled from the aisle. One day, "If you want to stand there for real," Isaiah would say, "make sure you stand for somebody who cannot stand alone." Caleb remembered those words more clearly than he remembered most birthdays. Then came the night the courthouse called their house after midnight, the night his father did not come home. Isaiah had been accused in the killing of a liquor store owner across town, tied to the scene by a witness who later disappeared, a handgun logged with a strange delay, and a mop bucket that prosecutors said proved he had been there cleaning up after himself. Caleb was 8 years old when he watched strangers pack his father's uniforms into a paper bag. He did not understand murder charges or felony procedure or why adults kept lowering their voices when he entered the room. He only understood that the man who made pancakes in the shape of Texas on Saturday mornings was suddenly being described on television as dangerous. During the trial, Judge Whitaker barely looked at Isaiah except when issuing warnings. The prosecutor called the mop bucket the silent witness, and the jury believed it. Caleb remembered his mother, Lorna, sitting stiff beside him, one hand around his shoulder, the other gripping a tissue until it tore. When the sentence came down, 15 years, the room blurred around Caleb. His father turned once before the deputies led him away, not crying, not pleading, just looking at his son with a steady sadness that seemed to say, "Remember who I am." Caleb did. While other boys collected baseball cards, he collected copies of court records. While other teenagers learned engines, he learned timestamps. He used the public library computers until the librarians knew to dim the lights around him instead of asking him to leave. He studied chain of custody, forms the way some kids studied playbooks, tracing every signature, every log minute, every smudged stamp. He did not have a law professor. He had overdue notices, old transcripts, and a father waiting in a prison visitation room 3 hours away. Every month, Isaiah told him to live his life. Every month, Caleb nodded and kept reading. By 19, he knew the case better than anyone who had once been paid to argue it. He knew the state's timeline like a prayer. He knew the liquor store clock in the evidence photo had been dismissed as background. He knew Officer Daniel Pierce had signed the arrest form at 8:52 in the evening. And he knew the mop bucket, the object they used to shame his father, could not have been in two places at once. That was why Caleb stood in court now with the old folder lifted in his hand, not as a boy playing lawyer, but as a son who had spent 15 years listening to a truth that never stopped knocking. Judge Harold Whitaker had built his life on the sound of people obeying him. For more than 30 years, his courtroom had operated like a room carved out of stone, where every chair, every flag, every polished rail seemed to lean toward the bench and wait for his voice. He liked that order. He liked the rise of bodies when he entered, the respectful silence after he spoke, the way attorneys shaped their sentences carefully when his eyes moved toward them. To the county newspapers, he was a symbol of discipline, a man who believed the law was only as strong as the people willing to enforce it without sentiment. To young prosecutors, he was a gatekeeper. To defense attorneys, he was a wall. To families like the Freemans, he had been something colder, a man who could turn a life into a file number, then close the folder and move on to lunch. Whitaker came from an old white family whose name appeared on plaques in 3 buildings downtown. His father had been a state senator. His grandfather had helped fund the courthouse renovation in the 1970s, the same renovation that left the cleaning staff using a basement break room with no windows, while judges received chambers lined with walnut shelves and private bathrooms. Whitaker never spoke openly of race in the ugly language of street corners. He was too educated for that, too careful, too proud of his manners. His contempt came dressed in procedure. He called black defendants by their last names with no warmth. He interrupted their mothers when grief made them speak too long. He praised officers for composure and questioned poor witnesses for nervousness. If a man wore a suit, Whitaker heard authority. If a man wore a uniform with a name patch, he heard service. If a man held a mop, Whitaker barely heard him at all. 15 years earlier, when Isaiah Freeman stood before him accused of a crime that did not fit the life everyone close to him knew, Whitaker had not seen a father who packed peanut butter sandwiches for night shifts. He had not seen the man who stayed after storms to mop rainwater from the courthouse lobby so elderly visitors would not slip. He had seen a black janitor from the wrong side of town, a man with no expensive lawyer, no political friends, and no protection against a story told confidently by people with badges and pressed shirts. During that trial, Whitaker let the prosecutor shape Isaiah into a symbol of hidden danger. He let Officer Daniel Pierce speak with the ease of a man certain the room would believe him. He let the mop bucket sit in front of the jury like an accusation, its yellow plastic sides catching the courtroom lights while Isaiah stared at it with quiet disbelief. When Isaiah's public defender objected, Whitaker overruled him with barely a glance. When Isaiah tried to explain that his bucket had been left at the courthouse that evening, Whitaker warned him to answer only what was asked. The sentence had been delivered in a voice so calm it sounded almost bored. 15 years. A gavel strike. A mother's breath breaking beside her child. A little boy watching the most powerful man in the room decide that his father's truth was not worth the time it took to hear it. Now that boy stood nearly grown, and Whitaker hated the feeling rising in the courtroom. It was not fear. He would never call it that. It was irritation sharpened by the possibility of embarrassment. Reporters were present. A county election was approaching. The appellate petition had already been dismissed twice, and this hearing was supposed to end cleanly, with a few formal remarks and a denial stamped before noon. Instead, Caleb Freeman had lifted a page and pulled the room's attention away from the bench. Whitaker looked down at the file in front of him, then toward Officer Pierce, who sat stiffly near the witness rail with his jaw set and his hands folded too neatly. For the first time all morning, the judge did not speak immediately. The silence was small, only a few seconds, but in Whitaker's courtroom, a few seconds of uncertainty felt like a crack running through marble. Caleb still held the evidence sheet under the courthouse light. The old timestamp waited there in black ink, patient and plain. And for the first time in 15 years, Judge Harold Whitaker could feel the room asking a question before he had given it. Permission. Attorney Grace Miller was the first person at the defense table to move. Until that moment, she had been sitting with the stillness of a woman who had spent too many years watching good arguments lose to bad timing, thin budgets, and courtrooms that pretended exhaustion was justice. Her blazer was slightly wrinkled from a morning spent carrying 3 case files under one arm and a coffee she had never finished in the other. She had met Caleb only twice before the hearing, once in her cramped county office with peeling paint near the window, and once in the courthouse hallway where he tried to show her the timestamp issue while she was being called into another case. She had listened, but not fully. Not because she did not care, but because the system had trained her to ration hope like medicine in short supply. Old convictions almost never reopened. Judges did not like admitting mistakes. Police records from 15 years ago did not suddenly become clean just because a son believed his father. But now Caleb's question hung over the room, and Grace felt something inside the file shift. She reached for the photocopy in Caleb's hand. He gave it to her without looking away from the bench. The page was warm from his grip. Grace scanned the evidence log, then the arrest report, then the crime scene photograph Caleb had marked with a yellow sticky note. 8:52 in the evening. Isaiah Freeman placed in custody outside the courthouse service entrance, according to Officer Pierce's own signature. 9:17 in the evening. Crime scene photograph taken at Robley's Liquor on West Mercer Street, showing the yellow mop bucket beside the back counter. 25 minutes. 3 miles apart. One man already detained. One piece of evidence appearing where it should not be. Grace stood slowly, her chair legs whispering against the wooden floor. "Your Honor," she said, and this time her voice carried a sharpness it had not carried before. The defense requests permission to question Officer Pierce regarding the chain of custody for this item. Judge Whitaker's gaze hardened. Ms. Miller, this is a post-conviction hearing, not a second trial. Grace held up the page. It may become one if the court record contains impossible evidence. The prosecutor, Martin Hale, rose immediately, smoothing his tie with the nervous precision of a man trying to look offended before he looked worried. Your Honor, this is speculation from a non-attorney family member. The state objects to turning this proceeding into a spectacle. Caleb heard the words non-attorney land exactly where they were aimed. He felt the old familiar heat in his chest, the heat of being told he had stepped beyond the line drawn for him. But he did not answer Hale. He kept his eyes on Officer Pierce. The older officer sat near the witness rail in a pressed uniform, shoulders square, silver badge shining under the fluorescent lights. 15 years had softened his face, but not his confidence. He looked at Caleb with the faint impatience of a man delayed by someone he considered beneath the machinery of law. Grace turned to the judge again. Officer Pierce is here because the state submitted his affidavit opposing relief. If his affidavit relies on the original evidence timeline, then this question is directly relevant. A murmur moved through the gallery, low and uneasy. Judge Whitaker struck the gavel once, not hard, but enough to remind the room who owned the air. Silence. Then he looked down at Caleb. Mr. Freeman, if I allow this, you will not grandstand. You will not make speeches. You will ask one question through counsel. Caleb swallowed. His father's eyes were on him from behind the rail, tired but bright with something dangerous and tender, hope. Caleb leaned toward Grace and whispered the exact wording he had practiced for years in bedrooms, bus stops, library corners, and prison visitation rooms. Grace listened. Her expression changed. Not dramatically, just a slight pause, a small tightening around the eyes, the look of a lawyer realizing that the person beside her had brought not emotion, but a blade made of facts. She nodded once. Your Honor, Grace said. The defense calls Officer Daniel Pierce for limited questioning. Pierce's jaw flexed. The prosecutor objected again, but his voice sounded thinner now. Judge Whitaker looked toward the reporters, then toward the clock above the clerk's desk, then back to the old photograph in Grace's hand. The judge did not want this door opened. Everyone could feel it, but to slam it shut too quickly, in a room full of witnesses, would make the silence louder. Limited questioning, Whitaker said at last. One line of inquiry. Nothing more. Officer Pierce rose and walked toward the witness chair, each step measured against the old wood floor. Caleb stepped back as Grace moved forward, but the question was still his. The courthouse lights hummed overhead. The yellow mop bucket in the photograph waited like a witness that had been quiet long enough. Officer Daniel Pierce settled into the witness chair as if it belonged to him. He raised his right hand, took the oath in a clear voice, and looked toward the bench with the practiced calm of a man who had testified hundreds of times and expected every room to bend around the weight of his badge. The leather of the chair gave a soft creak beneath him. His uniform was immaculate, the crease in his sleeves sharp enough to catch the light, his silver nameplate polished until it reflected a thin stripe of the courtroom ceiling. Caleb watched from beside the defense table, feeling the distance between them like a line drawn across the floor. Pierce had been 36 when he arrested Isaiah Freeman. Now he was older, heavier around the eyes, but the same confidence remained, a confidence Caleb had seen in every transcript, every statement, every interview where Pierce had spoken about his father as though Isaiah were not a man, but a problem already solved. Grace Miller approached the witness stand with the evidence photo in one hand and the arrest report in the other. Officer Pierce, she began, you signed the arrest report for Isaiah Freeman on June 3, 2009, correct? Pierce glanced at the paper and nodded. That is correct. And the time listed on that report is 8:52 in the evening. If that is what the report says, yes. Grace paused. I am asking if you wrote it. A small shift moved through the gallery. Pierce's mouth tightened. Yes, I wrote it. At the prosecutor's table, Martin. Hale leaned back with a thin smile, as though the answer had helped him. Judge Whitaker watched over the top of his glasses, his face unreadable. Grace lifted the crime scene photograph. Now, this photograph was submitted at trial as State's Exhibit 12. Do you recognize it? Pierce looked at the image for half a second. Yes, That is the back counter area of Robley's Liquor, and the yellow mop bucket visible in the lower right corner was presented as evidence connecting Mr. Freeman to the store. That was my understanding. Your understanding, Grace repeated softly. Officer Pierce, were you present when this photograph was taken? Pierce sat straighter. I was in and out of the scene throughout the evening. That was not my question. The room tightened. Caleb felt his father shift behind him, the faint sound of fabric against the wooden chair. Pierce looked toward the judge. I do not remember every exact minute from 15 years ago. Martin Hale rose. Objection. Asked and answered. Overruled for now, Whitaker said, though the words seemed to cost him something. Grace placed the photograph on the display screen for everyone to see. The old image appeared large and grainy above the clerk's desk, a narrow liquor store counter, a wall clock, a row of dusty bottles, and the yellow mop bucket that had become a silent accusation. A few people leaned forward. Someone in the back whispered before stopping themselves. Grace pointed toward the wall clock in the photo. Officer Pierce, what time does that clock show? Pierce looked once, then away. It appears to show around 9:17. Around? Grace asked. 9:17, Pierce said. His voice was still calm, but the edges had begun to dry out. Grace turned slightly, letting the silence breathe. And according to your own arrest report, Isaiah Freeman was already in your patrol car at 8:52. Pierce did not answer right away. The ceiling fans clicked above them. Yes, he said at last. Then please explain how the item you claim tied him to the crime scene was photographed there 25 minutes after he was already in custody. The question landed with no raised voice, no flourish, no anger, and somehow that made it heavier. Pierce blinked. Martin Hale stood again, faster this time. Objection. Counsel is mischaracterizing the record. Caleb's hands curled around the edge of the defense table, but he kept still. Grace did not look back at him. She kept her eyes on Pierce. I am reading the record the state created. Judge Whitaker's jaw hardened. Ms. Miller, tread carefully. Grace nodded once, but did not retreat. Pierce cleared his throat. The clock could have been wrong. A low murmur rolled through the room. Caleb's chest tightened, not with surprise, but with the ache of hearing the first door open. Grace reached for another page. That is possible. But the police camera also time-stamped the photograph at 9:17 and 42 seconds. She lifted the paper higher. 2 clocks, Officer Pierce. Same minute. The polished confidence on Pierce's face did not break, but it shifted, almost imperceptibly, like a curtain moving in a room with no open window. Judge Whitaker looked down at the file. Martin Hale stopped smiling. Isaiah Freeman closed his eyes for one brief second, as if the truth had touched him before anyone had dared to say its name. The courtroom did not explode. It emptied itself of sound. No one shouted. No one rushed forward. No dramatic confession broke through the air. There was only the thin electrical hum above the ceiling tiles, the slow turning of the fans, the faint click of a reporter's pen stopping in midair. Caleb stood so still that he could feel his own heartbeat in his fingertips. For 15 years, he had imagined this moment as thunder, as a door flying open, as the whole room finally seeing what he had seen alone at 2 in the morning under a library lamp. But truth did not arrive like thunder. It arrived like dust in a beam of sunlight, quiet, visible, impossible to deny once the light touched it. On the display screen, the old photograph remained frozen. The back counter of Robley's Liquor, the wall clock reading 9:17, the yellow mop bucket sitting in the corner like an object left by mistake. Caleb stared at it, and for a moment he was 8 years old again, kneeling on the courthouse floor while his father wrung dirty water from a mop and told him that every place had corners people forgot to clean. Now one forgotten corner had held his father's freedom for 15 years. Grace Miller lowered the document slightly, but her hand did not shake. Officer Pierce kept his eyes forward, yet the color had drained from the confidence in his face. The prosecutor shuffled papers that no longer seemed to help him. Judge Whitaker leaned back, then forward, then stopped with both hands flat on the bench as if the wood beneath him were the only solid thing left in the room. Caleb turned his head just enough to see Isaiah. His father had not moved. He sat with his shoulders drawn in, lips pressed together, eyes glistening but unbroken, the way a man looks when hope feels too dangerous to hold with both hands. Caleb wanted to run to him. He wanted to say, I found it, Dad. I found the place where they lied. But he stayed where he was, because the room still had to catch up to the truth. Grace let the silence stretch 1 second longer, then turned back to the witness stand. "Officer Pierce," she said, softer now, which somehow made every word sharper. "Where was Mr. Freeman's mop bucket between 8:52 and 9:17 that night?" Pierce swallowed. The movement was small, but everyone saw it. "I cannot say for certain." A whisper passed across the gallery. Judge Whitaker's eyes flicked toward the spectators. No gavel fell this time. Grace stepped closer to the display. "You testified at trial that the bucket was found at the scene when officers arrived. That was based on the information available to me. You were the arresting officer." "Yes." "You were listed as present during evidence recovery. At certain points. You signed the chain of custody transfer." Pierce's jaw tightened. "Yes." Grace held up the original log. "Then I will ask again. How did an item connected to a man already in custody appear in a police photograph taken 25 minutes later, 3 miles away?" Pierce looked toward Martin Hale, but the prosecutor was staring down at his own copy as though the paper had betrayed him. Caleb could hear the tiny sounds that filled the room now: a shoe shifting against the floor, the rustle of a sleeve, Isaiah's careful breath. The sunlight through the high windows had moved across the courtroom and settled on the defense table, touching the edges of Caleb's folder, warming the page that had almost been ignored. Judge Whitaker finally spoke, but his voice no longer carried the same clean authority. "Officer Pierce, answer the question." Pierce looked back at the judge. For the first time since taking the stand, he did not look like a man explaining the past. He looked like a man trapped inside it. "I would need to review the full record," he said. Grace nodded, slowly, as if she had expected nothing more. "So would we." Caleb closed his eyes for half a second. Not in relief. Not yet. But in the deep, shaking stillness of someone who had spent his whole life knocking on a locked door and had just heard the first bolt slide open. Judge Whitaker ordered a 10-minute recess, but nobody truly left the courtroom. They rose because the bailiff told them to rise. They stepped into the hallway because procedure required movement. Yet the questions stayed behind, filling every inch of the room like heat trapped after a summer storm. Caleb stood near the defense table with the folder pressed against his side, watching the door to the judge's chambers close. Across the aisle, Officer Pierce spoke in a low voice with Martin Hale, their shoulders angled away from the gallery, their faces tight with the careful expressions of men choosing words that might later matter. Grace Miller did not join them. She stayed beside Caleb, flipping through the copied records with new urgency, the pages whispering under her fingers. "You said there was another log," she murmured. Caleb nodded and pulled a folded sheet from the back pocket of the folder. "Basement storage intake. My father kept cleaning supplies there. The bucket number was written on the supply chart because the courthouse tracked equipment after budget cuts." Grace looked at him quickly. "You have the equipment number?" Caleb pointed to a faded line near the bottom. "Yellow rolling bucket, number C-17. The same number is visible in the crime scene photo if you zoom in near the handle." Grace's eyes moved from the sheet to Caleb's face, and something like respect settled there, quiet but unmistakable. "You found this where?" "In an old maintenance binder. They were throwing it out when the basement flooded 2 years ago." Grace exhaled slowly. "Caleb, this does not just challenge the timeline. This suggests the item came from this courthouse." The words made the hallway feel smaller. Caleb looked toward his father. Isaiah sat alone near the rail, guarded but not touched, his head bowed as if he were praying without moving his lips. The orange fabric of his uniform looked painfully bright under the courthouse lights. For 15 years, people had called that mop bucket proof that Isaiah had been at Robley's Liquor. But Caleb had always known the shape of his father's tools. He knew the crack along the left wheel. He knew the black marker on the handle where Isaiah had written C-17, so other janitors would stop taking it from the service closet. He knew because, as a boy, he had once ridden in that bucket down the empty courthouse hallway while Isaiah laughed and told him to keep his feet inside before they both got in trouble. That memory had survived longer than the trial's lies. When court resumed, Judge Whitaker returned with a face carved into restraint. His robe moved around him like a dark curtain as he sat, but the authority in the room no longer gathered as easily at his bench. Grace rose before he could speak. "Your Honor, The defense has located a courthouse maintenance record identifying the same bucket scene in State's Exhibit 12 as county property assigned to this building. Martin Hale was on his feet instantly. Your Honor, this is improper. We have not authenticated that document. Grace held it up. Then let us authenticate it. The clerk's office maintained these records. The custodian can verify them. Whitaker stared at the page as if it had appeared from a place beneath the courthouse itself. Approach. Grace walked forward with the document. Hale followed, jaw tight. Caleb remained standing behind the table, his eyes fixed on Officer Pierce. The officer was no longer looking at him. That was what made Caleb's chest tighten. For years, Pierce had occupied his imagination as a solid wall, a man whose testimony had sealed every door. Now Pierce stared at the edge of the witness stand, one thumb moving slowly across the side of his folded hand. The bailiff took the maintenance sheet to the bench. Whitaker studied it. His eyes stopped on the equipment number, then on the photograph, then on the number again. The courtroom waited. Grace said, Your Honor, if this record is accurate, the item used to connect Isaiah Freeman to the liquor store was not recovered from him, not owned by him, and not naturally present at that location. It came from this courthouse after his arrest. The sentence did not rise. It did not need to. It crossed the room with the force of a locked drawer opening. A woman in the back covered her mouth. One reporter began writing rapidly. Martin Hale looked toward Officer Pierce, and for the first time, he looked less like a prosecutor defending a conviction and more like a man realizing he had inherited a lie. Judge Whitaker lowered the paper. His gaze moved to Caleb, then to Isaiah, then finally to Pierce. Officer, he said, each syllable careful. Did you transport any item from this courthouse to Robley's Liquor on the night of June 3rd, 2009? Pierce's face remained still, but his silence changed everything. It stretched too long. It answered too much. Caleb felt the room turn with it. Not toward the badge, not toward the robe, toward the man in orange who had been telling the truth for 15 years. Officer Pierce did not answer the judge right away, and in that silence, the courtroom seemed to age 15 years in reverse. Every old assumption began to loosen. Every confident statement from the original trial began to sound different, not like fact, but like something placed carefully where no one was expected to look. Judge Whitaker leaned forward, his face pale beneath the hard courtroom lights. Officer Pierce, he said again, quieter this time. Did you transport county property from this courthouse to Robley's Liquor on the night in question? Pierce's eyes moved once, toward Martin Hale, but the prosecutor no longer rose to protect him. Hale stood still beside the table, one hand resting on a closed folder, his expression stripped of certainty. Grace Miller waited with both documents in front of her, the arrest report and the maintenance record touching at the corners like two pieces of a truth finally meeting. Pierce swallowed. I do not recall transporting anything. It was not a denial. Everyone heard the difference. Caleb felt it pass through the room, a cold current beneath warm air. Grace stepped forward. Your Honor, the defense requests immediate preservation of all courthouse maintenance logs, police transfer sheets, evidence room access records, and dispatch recordings from June 3rd, 2009. We also request that Mr. Freeman's conviction be vacated or, at minimum, that he be released pending a full evidentiary review. Released, Hill said, but the word came out too late and too weak. Grace turned toward him. The state's central physical evidence has become evidence of possible misconduct. My client has served 15 years on a timeline that cannot stand. Isaiah lifted his head when she said my client. Not the defendant, not the inmate. My client. The words touched him gently, but visibly, as if someone had returned a small part of his name before the court was ready to return the rest. Judge Whitaker looked down at the file he had expected to close before noon. Caleb watched the judge's fingers rest on the edge of the page, older now than they had seemed when the hearing began. This was the same hand that had signed the original judgment, the same hand that had dismissed earlier petitions with brief orders and formal language. For a moment, Caleb saw not power, but the weight of power when it finally realizes it has been wrong. Whitaker removed his glasses and set them on the bench. The room held its breath. Mr. Freeman, he said, looking at Isaiah, not Caleb, this court is deeply concerned by what has been presented today. Isaiah did not speak. His dignity did not hurry to meet the judge's discomfort. Whitaker's voice roughened. The court orders an immediate evidentiary hearing, appointment of independent counsel, and release of Isaiah Freeman under supervised conditions pending review. A sound moved through the gallery. Not applause, not celebration, but the sudden breaking of held breath. Grace closed her eyes for 1 second. Caleb did not move until he heard the clerk repeat the order. Release. The word felt unreal, too small for what it carried. A deputy approached Isaiah, not roughly, not with command, but with a hesitation that seemed almost respectful. The restraints were removed from Isaiah's wrists. The simple sound of metal opening seemed louder than any gavel strike Caleb had ever heard. Isaiah looked down at his hands as if seeing them for the first time in years. Then he looked at his son. Caleb stepped forward, but slowly, because this moment had waited too long to be rushed. When they met beside the defense table, Isaiah placed both hands on Caleb's shoulders. His palms were rough, still a janitor's hands despite everything the system had tried to rename him. You remembered, Isaiah whispered. Caleb's face tightened, but he held himself steady. You told me to stand for somebody who could not stand alone. Isaiah pulled him close. No speech followed. No grand accusation. Caleb did not turn toward Pierce with triumph, and he did not demand that Whitaker look at him again. His father was breathing against his shoulder, free enough to stand, free enough to be held, and for that moment, Caleb chose mercy over performance. Judge Whitaker watched from the bench, the black robe suddenly looking less like authority and more like cloth. When Caleb finally stepped back, the judge lowered his eyes. Mr. Freeman, Whitaker said, and this time Caleb knew he meant both of them. This court owes your family more than a review. Caleb looked at him without anger, which made the words he spoke even heavier. Then start with his name. The judge nodded once. Slowly, publicly, and for the first time in 15 years, the clerk read the name Isaiah Freeman into the record not as a convicted man, but as a man whose truth had forced the room to listen. By late afternoon, the courthouse steps glowed under a soft amber light, the kind that made even old stone look almost gentle. Isaiah Freeman walked through the front doors slowly, not because anyone stopped him, but because his body had forgotten what it felt like to leave a place without being told where to stand next. For 15 years, every doorway had belonged to someone else. Every hallway had been measured by permission. Now the same courthouse that had once swallowed his name opened onto Main Street, where traffic moved past in ordinary lines, and a flag snapped lightly in the warm Georgia wind. Caleb walked beside him, close enough that their sleeves brushed. He carried the old folder under one arm and his father's courthouse employee badge in his hand. He had found it years earlier in a cardboard box behind their apartment closet, tucked between Isaiah's spare uniform shirt and a pair of work gloves stiff with dried floor wax. The plastic was scratched. The photograph inside showed a younger Isaiah with fuller cheeks, clear eyes, and a smile too honest for the building that had failed him. Under the picture, in faded blue letters, it read Isaiah Freeman, Maintenance Department. Caleb had carried that badge to every prison visit, every library night, every hearing that ended with another denial. It had become proof that his father had not started as a case number. He had started as a man who worked, laughed, paid rent, packed lunches, raised a son, and cleaned a courthouse that did not protect him. At the bottom of the steps, Attorney Grace Miller stood with a phone pressed to her ear, already arranging the next filings, the next motions, the next fight. When she saw Isaiah, she lowered the phone and gave him a small nod. Not pity, respect. Martin Hale came out a few minutes later, carrying his briefcase like it weighed more than it had that morning. He did not look at Caleb for long, but when he passed Isaiah, he stopped. Mr. Freeman, he said quietly, the state will review every related record. Isaiah looked at him, and the silence between them held 15 years of birthdays, school graduations, rent notices, bus rides, and prison visiting room tables. Then Isaiah nodded once. Make sure you review the parts nobody wanted to read. Hale's eyes fell. He had no answer large enough, so he gave none. Behind the courthouse windows, Judge Whitaker remained in his chambers. Caleb could see his outline through the second-floor glass, still, small, no longer above anyone from that distance. For the first time, Caleb did not wonder what the judge thought of him. It did not matter. The bench had spoken too late, but the truth had spoken anyway. Isaiah reached the final step and stopped. He looked down at the stone beneath his shoes. I used to mop right here every Thursday night, he said, almost smiling. People tracked in mud from the parking lot after rain. Caleb looked at the steps, then at the badge in his palm. Without a word, he walked back up 3 steps and placed the badge on the wide stone ledge beside the courthouse entrance. Isaiah watched him do it. "You sure?" he asked. Caleb nodded. "You do not need that to prove you belonged here." The wind moved softly between them. A bus hissed at the corner. Somewhere nearby, a church bell marked the hour. Isaiah took a long breath, deeper than any breath he had taken inside the courtroom, and the air seemed to enter him carefully, as if returning something it had been holding. Caleb stepped down and stood beside him again. For a moment, neither of them moved. They looked like 2 shadows joined at the edge of a building that had once separated them. Then Isaiah reached for his son's hand, not the way a father holds a child, but the way one man steadies another after a long road. Caleb held on. Together they walked toward the sidewalk, past reporters who lowered their cameras, past clerks who did not know what to say, past deputies standing silent near the door. No one applauded. No one needed to. The sound that mattered was smaller. 2 pairs of shoes on courthouse stone, moving away from the place that had mistaken quietness for guilt and poverty for shame. At the curb, Isaiah paused and looked up at the sky, wide and blue above the white columns. Caleb followed his gaze. There was no speech, no perfect ending, no way to hand back 15 years before sunset. But the light fell on them evenly now, on father and son, on dark skin warmed by the same American sun that had watched the whole story unfold. Isaiah squeezed Caleb's hand once, then let go. They stepped into the crosswalk when the signal changed, walking not toward revenge, not toward applause, but toward dinner somewhere simple, toward a phone call to Lorna, toward a night without prison walls, toward a name spoken cleanly at last. Behind them, on the courthouse ledge, the old badge caught the fading light, and for a brief, quiet second, the plastic surface shone brighter than the judge's bench ever had.